Well, what's so important is that I mean, the arts, if they're successful, it carries not just the idea, say, of an injustice and tells you a story, but it makes you feel it at the same time that you are learning, the facts that make you feel like you've got to respond in some way. And I don't. It's like you can't retreat from that feeling. It's like when people see one of my portraits that might not make much difference, but then they see, 100 of them, and realize that the history of resistance in this country, and then ask themselves, well, what kind of a community they want to be part of. The part of the community that necessitated the creation of this kind of resistance, or part of the community of resistance itself. And I think they feel that inspiration.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Truth and Reckoning. Today's episode is a conversation between our executive director here at the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, Kai Huschke, and Robert Shetterly. Robert Shetterly is an activist and an artist. He was born in Cincinnati in 1946, and he became involved in art after graduating from Harvard. He was part of the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and he's best known today for a series of portraits that he has painted. At this point, there's more than 260 of them. The series is called Americans Who Tell the Truth. And these portraits are of people who have spoken up on the important and critical social issues of our time. We're talking environmental activists, anti-imperialist activists, anti-racist activists throughout American history and contemporary today. Robert has toured across the country with these portraits. He's exhibited them in universities, in schools, in community spaces of all different kinds. And he uses them to spark conversations about what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a contributing member of society? What does it mean to address the most important issues that we're facing today? It's very powerful work. I've seen Robert's portraits for many years, never in person, unfortunately, but I was glad to be able to help edit and produce this conversation, to bring you this conversation with Robert on the power of art, on how art and political movements can be linked together, can reinforce each other, how creativity can sometimes help us bypass the hyper-rationality of our thinking minds and bring us into our bodies, our hearts, into deeper connection with the land and what's needed. Robert also wrote the introduction to the latest book published by CELDF. It's called Can You Handle the Truth? It came out just a few months ago, and folks can check that out on our website if you're interested in it. Without further ado, here's the conversation with Robert Shetterly.
But my journey, I guess, probably about using art to make political, environmental statements, began in the early 90s when I was asked to do the editorial drawings for the Maine Times newspaper, which was a counterculture political paper of real importance in the state of Maine for many, many years. And I had been, up to that point, the editorial director and artist of a little farm and garden magazine. I was drawing pigs and chickens and broccoli and how to straighten a fence and how to build a barn and, all that kind of stuff. And that's how I'm a self-taught artist, and I was trying to draw those things as though I were Leonardo. I was learning, copying his drawings and to learn how to use my, get a fluency of line in my hand and try to make any kind of drawing beautiful. That was fascinating to me. And then as that paper, that little magazine grew up, it started to having more of a sort of a political stance about foreign policy and agribusiness and all that kind of stuff. And so I was beginning to draw more pictures that had to do with policy
Mhm.
and politics as much as, what a certain kind of apple looks like. And so in doing that, when I left the little farm and garden magazine, which was called Farmstead, the Maine Times newspaper asked me to draw for them. And I spent the next 13 years drawing. They allowed me to do anything I wanted. It was just amazing. I could draw way out there stuff that very few people even understood. And there were a lot of
Mhm.
complaints, but a lot of it was politically generated. It was a good lesson in how to draw something that isn't just a rant, that actually has some perhaps important metaphoric content in it, or teaches how to place anger in the right context, or exposes something as best as you can expose it. Good political cartooning, and I never considered myself as good as many of the people who are actually doing that kind of thing, are really adept at analyzing situations and helping people understand the good guys and the bad guys, and how to think about it in just a really good picture or a good caption.
Did you
Anyway, that was my kind of first lesson in that.
Yeah. Did you grow up in a family or in a community where sort of being politically active in the ways that I see you through your work today, or is that something kind of you discovered through other connections and relationships over time, or what
No,
sort
I grew
of
up in a Republican corporate family in Cincinnati. After college, I went to live in the mountains in West Virginia and taught school in a little two-room schoolhouse. But it was in college that I had to deal with the Vietnam War, and that was the first time I understood what it meant to take a risky stance. I mean, I turned my draft card in. I assumed I would go to jail, and for reasons that I never understood, I was never prosecuted.
Mhm.
But that was my intent. I mean, my idea was, if enough middle-class white kids go to jail against this war, it might actually make a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, I was doing all the kind of protest things too. And also at that time, I got involved in civil rights work. I helped as a high school student, integrate my white high school in Cincinnati by the students, small group of students demanding that it be integrated, and we succeeded. And I had an older brother who had gone to Mississippi in 1964 as part of Freedom Summer. That was a huge lesson for me about courage, and
Mhm.
also a lesson about what was really going on in this country in terms of race and the resistance to fixing the problem and how dangerous that was.
That's in
So I grew up with those things.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, it's interesting just in context of today, right, with what's happening on university campuses to silence any of that kind of dissent or challenge to the status quo, right? There's that immediate clamping down and punishment. I mean, have you thought about sort of your time back during the Vietnam War compared to today? And then I think in combination to that, one of the other things I wanted to ask you is, I mean, just how swift it's been in the sense of trying to censor free speech, but also, this era, not that there wasn't propaganda in the past, right? Not that there wasn't misinformation or myth being created, right? That's been there all along. That's how centralized power stays in power. But the ability now through communication channels to spread misinformation, or what has been dubbed fake news, like, how have you looked at that, or how have you thought about that in relation to the work you're doing to tell what I would say are deeper truths, right, from people who've had to navigate different things or maybe similar things over their times? And I know you've got to sit down with a number of the people that you've illustrated, and those that had passed already. You spent time probably researching them, and so in some ways you've had conversations with them. So yeah, what's it been like for you comparing sort of now to the past, whether it's a past that you were a part of as a college student, or more deeply? How do we get to those deep truths? How do we deal with them? Right, we've got to spend time with them, especially the ones that are the deepest. They're the most shocking.
Well, there are obviously some real similarities. I mean, my political education, and especially around, say, the Vietnam War, came about by going to talks at the Brattle Theater in Harvard Square, listening to Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn talk about the history of Vietnam and the history of colonialism and the French and the U.S. involvement and Ho Chi Minh, who he really was, hearing all this history which I was not getting other places, and then realizing that one was going to have to make choices and that there were good examples of doing that. And then, I got arrested, in a building takeover and that kind of thing. But the stakes were a little bit different. I mean, and maybe considerably different. I mean, we get arrested, and, a lot of us spent a night in jail, and that was pretty much the end of it, except it stayed on our record. So at other times in my life when I've been arrested for other political things, that always comes up, that I'm a hardened criminal. But I mean, those people, those professors who were delivering those messages, and there were many more, would have been today kicked out of schools, suspended. The students might have been suspended, some of them deported. I mean, the stakes are more extreme, especially this whole business around anti-Semitism is very disturbing, that when the facts are so historically and visibly clear about what is actually going on,
Mhm.
and that you can't call out a policy of an atrocious government and call it what it is without risking being suspended from school, having or something else happening. I mean, that's just terrible. I mean, that is absolutely counter to what the mission of a university is supposed to be. And then the giving over, as some of these schools have done, to their curriculum policies and administrative policies and admission policies and all those kinds of things. I mean, that was never a question in the 60s. Universities, as bad as they often were in terms of going after their own students, would never have surrendered their sovereignty, if you will, to make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah. When also, I mean, there's, the recent legislation around, criminalization of the homeless, which of course is not new, but it's being expanded, right? So anyone who's, houseless, anyone who's propertyless, basically, now we're going to deem you a criminal, which then, it has a wide net in the way that it's been drafted. So it's, again, another means to, I think, attack dissent or attack challenge or attack truth tellers. So,
Well, attack compassion.
yeah.
Attack actually looking at the causes for problems like that. Where do they come from? And what is the best economic and compassionate way to deal with them? And why is it an institutional problem? And then how do we handle that? I mean, those are the questions that should be asked. And then the solution should be certainly a bipartisan way of dealing with an essential, governmental problem. I mean, I remember I was at a conference in Kentucky one time in Louisville, and a man defined the success of a government as being able to identify a problem and fix it, period.
Mhm.
And I was impressed. Let's just begin there in
Yeah.
terms of, what is the usefulness of a government? Why do we have them in the first place? I mean, besides, protecting our rights and things, but to, collectively, for the common good, identify and solve problems.
Yeah. I wanted to maybe just shift over to the Americans Who Tell the Truth project. I mean, can you give us a sense of what that is, what it looks like? Maybe, I don't know how many portraits you're up to, but it's a lot. Are there particular people, either contemporarily or distant past, that really affected you, and also maybe are great examples of what we should be looking to in this day and age, especially as we were just talking about the difficulty of hearing the truth, just hearing it, right? Let alone reconciling with it, let alone acting upon trying to change it, when you have, repressive measures being accelerated and amplified, when you've got, obviously over the decades now, the higher concentration of corporate media ownership of media itself, so that independent voice is very difficult in this day and age. All the social media platforms that have ease of capability of spreading fake news. I mean, there's all this kind of noise and distraction. And as you said also earlier, now you're seeing opportunity through the Americans Who Tell the Truth project. And kind of want listeners to understand a little bit more what it is and sort of the value that it brings. And maybe, again, the impact that it's had on you after all these years of driving this project.
I began painting these portraits reluctantly. I mean, this was not the voice that I had come to, was not really a political voice. I had developed a voice as an artist, as a surrealist.
Mm-hmm.
If I was telling and exploring truth, it was the more sort of complicated, mysterious, and ambiguous truths that we all have in our lives. Why did anybody do anything? That's why people write novels and poetry and stuff, is to examine those kinds of questions. And I loved doing that in art, making things, using the surreal kind of approach to artistic content, inviting people into a picture like that to say that I'm not going to tell you what to think about this, but I'm going to invite you to look at this picture and use your own imagination and experience to explore it and yourself. And that seemed my important artistic goal. And also my best social function as an artist was to do the work that seemed the most interesting and also curious and honest to myself about how to try to understand the world. That all changed for me right after 9/11, not because of 9/11 itself, but because of the U.S. government's Bush-Cheney administration's beginning to use 9/11 as a pretext for all the propaganda and lies to attack Iraq. I was just outraged. I mean, all the wars of, I mean, I'm quite a bit older than you, but all the wars of my adult life, from Vietnam through Central America, the first Gulf War, second Panama, Grenada, all these things, we've been lied to about all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Every one of them is based in lies. And that had always made me very disturbed. And I'd, done my protesting and this and that, but it was kind of a sideline for me. But in the run up to the Iraq War, it was so blatant and it was so clear that so many people were going to be hurt, so many environments disrupted, so much of our future disrupted and changed irrevocably, probably because of that. I kept thinking either I should leave this country because of my distaste for what was happening on and the sense of not just outrage, what I would call, or what Terry Tempest Williams calls sacred rage, this sense that there's an enormous violation to humanity and nature that is about to take place. And the only thing to feel is a kind of sacred rage against that kind of action. The question is what to do with that. One instinct was to leave. The other instinct was if everybody who cared about this left the country, how would that look? I mean, what country of this kind of power, if all the people who identified what was wrong left, it would accelerate to the point where we are now, frankly.
Yep.
But anyway, so I decided I got to do something, and I got to use the thing that I do best, which is paint. I also knew that it would do nobody any good, including myself, to just sort of rant through my painting, because I'd done that when I was doing editorial drawing sometimes. I knew that doesn't really persuade people. It just reinforces your side. And so I had to find another way. And the important thing for me was to take all this energy of rage and grief and use it in a positive way then, not to rant, but to engage people in some way, but primarily as therapy for myself. I mean, I was so upset. I could actually feel that I was making myself sick with my own anger.
Huh.
And I thought, I mean, really? And I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. And though finally one day the solution appeared, it was in a very simple one, really. Instead of allowing Bush and Cheney and Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and Pearl and all those people, all that space in my heart and mind, I had to exercise them by replacing them with people that made me feel good about this country, or at least about the values of the country and its ideals. People who had stood up against the people who had always been wanting to take them away or had never provided them in the first place. Yep. And had risked themselves and their communities and their lives and often succeeded in some amazing ways in changing the direction of the country or its own honesty. And so I thought, I'll paint, just a handful of these portraits. They will be like a little community for me. And I started with Walt Whitman, which I'll say something about in a minute. And then, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Mother Jones, Jane Addams, Susan B. Anthony, all these 19th century figures, which we know as icons of, political change about race and gender and labor rights and things in this country. And I thought,
well, that's very interesting. You chose that kind of era, right? Because that was what a lot of those people dubbed, the Second American Revolution. Because
absolutely,
it was the push to try to formulate government to really be about, people in place and basically rights against the power of property. So, you had that opening that there was a lot of probably hope and enthusiasm and an energy that, that those people that you have identified, or a number of those people, would be recognized basically as people. So no, it's interesting that that's where you
Yeah,
started.
exactly. I mean, you realize that those, attacks on, well, the promulgation of the ideals of the country, having never been realized and never actually intended to be realized by the people who wrote them.
Yeah, correct.
The incredible truth of the language, though, was so powerful that people who wanted to fight against the structures that had been set in place could use the language of the people who had written it against their own structures. And that was so exciting to me. And of course, I started with just the strongest examples of that. And a lot of those people and what they had to say have stuck with me in regard to, well, for instance, the reason I started with Walt Whitman was that I think he understood the democratic impulse at its most profound level, that it wasn't just about people, that it was about all living things, and that our health on this planet depended on our relationship in desiring the flourishing of all living things. And he begins, the quote that I put on his painting is from the second forward to his great book, Leaves of Grass, where he says, "This is what you shall do. Love the earth, the sun, and the animals." That's the first thing. And of course, in a sense, when you think of the original sins of this country, and people think of slavery and indigenous Jewish genocide, etc., what they don't name, which precedes all of those things, or any of those things, is our relationship with nature.
Yep.
But he understood that we weren't going to survive on the planet or be healthy on this planet unless we understood that our place in it was equal and not grander or greater or more powerful, really, and more powerful in a way, of course, but maybe not ultimately, than any other species on the planet, plant or animal.
And that's the crux, right? I mean, we're not in right relationship. I mean, through CELDF's work, of course, we've been leaders in pushing legal rights of nature as an element of that. But I mean, I think you've just put your finger on exactly what's that's a deep, deep truth, right? That is so not talked about, so not dealt with. And the abuse of the non-human world is so prolific. And despite what you just pointed out, in the sense that we are nature, and without that, we will not survive. And ideally, if we can understand that and come to that, we can have so much better of an existence. So I really appreciate that
Well, it's so
you went
strange,
there.
isn't it? It's so strange that, I mean, we tout ourselves as being so intelligent and civilized that we would miss the most obvious thing.
Yeah.
That our life, the health of our life and the continuity, the survival for our now and for generations depends on our relationship with nature and accepting nature's laws. I mean, how
And the
incredible.
knowledge that, just the tremendous amount of knowledge we would gain if we could just be quiet, right? And listen
Right.
and observe.
When I mentioned very early in passing that right out of college, I had taught school in the mountains in West Virginia. And I'd met a man there named Perry Mann, who was a former high school history teacher and a lawyer. He was like many of you, people who follow you and the work of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and your audience would certainly know who Wendell Berry is, and the importance he has been in describing and teaching a land ethic. This man, Perry Mann, who I found in Hinton, West Virginia, when I was down there teaching, was like a very obscure Wendell Berry. He was, besides his teaching and lawyering, he was also an organic farmer, and he understood all these things about right relationship with nature. And when I started this project, I mean, he was, I think, the first person in my life that I had encountered who was living in a hostile environment on the strength of his integrity.
Huh.
And when he was opposed to almost everything in the culture around him, but he was also greatly admired for his integrity in that culture. And I went back to West Virginia to meet him, and luckily I did a couple of years before he died. And he was one of the very first portraits. And the quote that's on his portrait is, "No lobbyist can bribe nature. In the end, all politicians and everyone else must accept the mandates of nature and the consequences of violating them.
Huh.
And then he said, in that is my optimism. I mean, he's assuming that we're going to learn that lesson and have time
Mhm.
at the other end to do something about it.
Yeah.
There's the optimism. And the most difficult thing for us right now is we're realizing we may be running out of the window
Yeah.
of time.
Well, I don't think you and I would be doing what we do if we didn't have at least some degree of that optimism, right? Otherwise, we would probably just curl up in a ball.
Exactly. I mean, we're aware that things are changing and changing faster than we can respond, but how we will survive and the nature of the communities we will build in response to that are still open questions. And that's really important.
So that, I mean, you started with a kind of the handful and started painting and incorporating the quotes. And so, like, at what point did it sort of become sort of what it is today, or the beginnings of what you're involved in today?
Yeah, I actually thought I'd have a bunch of portraits. I didn't have any grandiose ideas of how many I would do. I thought a small number,
Mhm.
and that I would basically put them in my basement. And when I was upset, I'd go talk to them.
Yeah.
We all need people to talk to, and I thought if I could go down in my basement and put my arm around Frederick Douglass and have a conversation with him, I'd come out the better for it. And so that was the goal. But I started showing them. It was still 6 months before the actual invasion of Iraq. And I showed the first 10 or 12 of them in a little sandwich shop in Ellsworth, Maine.
Hmm.
And I was expecting, I mean, this is a fairly purplish area, but it's also very patriotic with a lot of
Yep.
flags and a lot
Yep.
of support for the possibility of this war. And most people, no, I don't know, most people, but an awful lot of people, probably a majority of people bought the idea that the government's fear was giving them that we were in some, imminent danger from attack by Iraq. And it was clear what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I expected a pretty hostile response. And instead, it was just the opposite. I from the very first painting, I thought I will never sell these paintings. I will eventually, however many they are, if I want to do something with them, I will give them away.
Yeah.
Which is still the plan. Now that there are over 280 of them, it's still the
my God.
plan. But
You got a big basement, Robert.
I built some big racks, and they can all be filed, double-decker racks.
Yeah.
And people would write to me and say, gee, I see what you're doing. I see you're not going to sell these paintings. Here's $25, buy some more paint. And then a couple of schools called up and asked me if I'd come in and talk about who these were.
Mhm.
I mean, in that first group, I mentioned Wendell Berry. Well, he was even though I was concentrating on 19th century figures, from the beginning, I put in a few contemporary people.
Mhm.
And I put in Wendell Berry. And the quote that I scratched, he wrote an essay at the end of the first Gulf War in 1991 that ended with this sentence. He said, the most alarming sign, the most alarming sign of the state of our society now is that our leaders have the courage to sacrifice the lives of young people in war, but not the courage to tell us to be less greedy and less wasteful. And when I'm in a high school, now because of these portraits, my life has totally changed. I mean, I'm in front of kids all the time, talking about them and telling the stories of who these people were and why they are important role models for what needs to be done today. But I'll present a quote like that. And I'll say, kids, what does this mean? What are these two courages that he's talking about? Why is it a different kind of courage to send your own children off to war to die and kill than it is to tell people to be less wasteful and greedy? And they get it pretty soon. They'll say, well, in our society, capitalism, they'll put it different ways, capitalism, commercialism, consumption, materialism are actually more important than other people's lives, even than your own children's lives, that you will sacrifice your own children to keep that economy going. And I'm sure you remember, but not everybody does. Right after 9/11, it was 3 days after, when Bush went to New York and stood on that big crane over the rubble of the Twin Towers, which was still smoking and reeking of plastics and human bodies and things. And he advised people to get over their grief, to alleviate their grief by going shopping.
As soon as you started telling the story, that's exactly what was in my head.
And I think most people thought, has anybody ever been so insensitive? Has anybody ever been so stupid as to say something that callous or just
Yeah.
unfeeling?
You just talked about painting surrealism. Like you could have painted the actual scene with the quote and that would have been surreal, right? This idea that you're going to send people to die and to kill others for the sake of, power. And then all the other people are supposed to just go shopping. Like, don't bother yourself, right? Turn your back, go shop, make yourself happy. We've got it over here. And I mean, talk about surreal.
Exactly. But I think the point was that he more afraid of, 3,000 people dying in that horrible building falling down and everything, buildings, was the idea that the economy would slow down.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't, from his point of view, it was exactly what Wendell Berry was saying. It had a real capitalist logic to it.
Yeah.
We're going to have some shocks here, but don't stop buying stuff, folks.
Yeah.
Because that would be a worse shock.
Yeah, or in that moment, the ability to pause and have actually some space for reflection, right? And
Exactly.
personal reflection, and then eventually communal conversation, which more contemporarily, of course, we had during the pandemic. Things literally ground to the halt. I mean, I always think about it as nature organized, the best strike that there's ever been, right? I mean, they literally shuttered the planet, which I thought in a lot of ways was brilliant. And of course, I'm not ignorant to the impacts of people, who've passed because of that. And it was there for a while where it really felt, I mean, you could almost feel it. I don't know about you. You could feel the sense that people were actually taking time. People were thinking, people were questioning, people were challenging, whether they were diving as deep as you have gone in your work or not. Then suddenly it's like, crap, we can't let this go on. We've got to now get people shopping again, buying things again. We've got to get this machine going again. It can't stay shuttered any longer. So yeah, it's all those moments, whether they're that more obvious than that or more subtle, but it's very much that reality that we're living. That's one of the deep truths that I think we're unwilling or unable or somehow to really reconcile with. And until we do, it's very difficult to see transformative change coming into play.
At that same time, I had painted a portrait of Marion Wright Edelman, who was the great founder and lobbyist for poor children, the head of the Children's Legal Defense Fund. And she had said on her painting, the quote was, "What's wrong with our children? It's adults telling children to be honest while they're lying and cheating. It's adults telling children to be nonviolent while they're marketing and glorifying violence.
Yeah.
I believe adult hypocrisy is the biggest problem children face in America." And that's with the same way I've engaged high school and college classes with that quote of hers, and saying, okay, what does that mean? Are people actually so willingly hypocritical and that they would double bind their own children that way, say one thing and do the other, so they're giving two different messages about violence and about honesty? And the kids think, no, most of our parents are good people who want us to be honest. They want us to be nonviolent, but we're all so integrated into those systems, which are so profoundly dishonest and so profoundly violent, that against our will, in many cases, we're engaged in those very things. And that, the conclusion is similar to the one about, from Wendell Berry, that the corporate order, demands a dishonesty and demands a violence to nature and to people and to its own ideals that we have a very hard time dealing with. I mean, when you're talking about the profound questions, they're right there. And then the question, well, what do you do then? How do we confront this? How do we get out of this being so embedded in these systems?
Well, I like that you phrased, that was phrased as hypocrisy. I mean, I hadn't really associated that word, but the truth of the system is it's designed to do what it does. And that's a very difficult thing to see very often. And then when you are exposed to it to accept, right? That it's been designed to feed the endless production of more machine, which is often what Richard Grossman, who's another person you've painted his portrait, it's purposely put together to do that, to consume, to extract, to degrade, to dismiss for the sake of centralized power. The system isn't broken, it's fixed to operate that way. But the
Exactly.
hypocrisy is we're fed a very different mythology of democracy and opportunity and, all these other things that make it seem as if that's what the machine is about, but that's not what the machine is about. So yeah, you've got
Right.
these weird tension going on. And I think my sense is, again, this may be a little bit the optimist, is at least people, I think, for the most part, feel that if they don't quite understand it. And so that's why I've appreciated your project there and it's great that these schools have even given you the opportunity, especially in the educational system. I'm sure you've probably found that difficult at times in trying to get your work and the messages of these various people out. I mean, you talked about at the very beginning, having a very large project just be canceled. Have you had a number of those kind of things happen, or the inability to get in front of younger people to have these kinds of engagements, or has it mostly been positive?
Well, there are, of course, a lot of places I don't get invited, so I don't know what the reasons are. But actually, it's been fewer than I would have expected. I mean,
Okay.
in terms of um, negative response or cancellations. One of the first was uh, a museum in Los Angeles, which was going to have a pretty big show. Somebody on their board saw that I had painted. It was a Holocaust museum.
Mm-hmm.
And this is years ago, but somebody saw that I had painted Noam Chomsky. And even though they didn't have to have his painting, I mean, the venues for these paintings, the portraits that go in each venue are chosen by the venue
Yeah.
themselves.
So they can select.
I don't send them, but so they can go through all these portraits and pick out the ones that are most consistent with their own ideas. But they saw that the fact that I had painted Chomsky, who had made pro-Palestinian statements, was enough to cancel the show. But the funny thing is here, and the curious thing is about the fact that it's art.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I get invited places because of the quality of the art, I think. And often people haven't really thought about what the part of the messaging of it. And so I get invited places where the portraits themselves, I mean, the people in the portraits would not be invited.
Yeah.
Because they're maybe seen as too radical or too challenging or whatever it is. And so, but I get invited and then I can stand up behind them like a ventriloquist and hold them up and say, kids, this is what Naomi Klein said.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah.
And, all of a sudden you're in a very different climate. And of course, the kids, for the most part, love it. I mean, in most schools, kids aren't being taught this kind of thinking or these contradictions that are in our society. They aren't talked about, but it's not that they may not be taught them, but somehow they've internalized them. They suspect them and they're relieved, when somebody will stand up and say what in fact's going on. I mean, it explains so much when you start to understand, about the level of racism in the country and what happens because of it, or the level of misogyny, or the labor practices and what happened to labor unions and all that sort of stuff. And, who benefited. I mean, one of the currents that runs through all the portraits is like the advice to any good journalist: follow the money.
Yeah.
So much of the problems in our society, even from the Constitution on, when it established the right of property rights, is about money. And so many of the profound problems are putting profit ahead of our own ideals.
It's been very interesting for us organizationally. We've always tried to frame our work really not as sort of legal or political, but really cultural work, even though it's sort of been contained within sort of the legal realm. But that's really expanded over the last few years. We had an event called Truth&Reckoning and Right Relationship with the Great Lakes that was really actually inspired by an artist who was inspired by our activism. So you've got this interrelation going on, and she created a whole exhibit that was featured at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland at MoCA, and eventually also a giant neon sign that talked about the rights of Lake Erie that was placed on the Science Center building right on the edge of the lake. So anyone coming in off the water would see this tribute to nature's rights. They're in your face, nice and bright. So we designed this whole event really around her art exhibit, and that's now spurned more activism. So they got this interesting flow between the arts and activism. And her workshop that she hosted at this physical gathering we had at the museum was called Art as a Trojan Horse. So when you said, the art brought you in and it gave you an opportunity to be the ventriloquist, she has that same sort of thinking and sort of blending the art and activism and how art really can serve this important function for transformative change, which, of course, historically, I'm sure you've delved into that. There's so much power that comes from the arts, whether it's the poetry or, the writing or the creation of plays or the painting of portraits, those, the music that's come out as well. All of that stuff is so very critical, I think, if we're going to have that transformative change really picked up the momentum it needs to be picked up.
Well, absolutely. That's so important. I mean, I mentioned hearing Zinn and Chomsky speak and being educated about the real history of Vietnam. But both prior to that and at the same time, I think my greatest education in a couple different levels was happening because of the music of the times. I mean, there was Dylan, and there was Odetta, and there was Joan Baez, and there was Peter, Paul, and Mary, and there was Tom Lehrer, and, on and on and on. And when the media of this country were not telling the truth about what was going on around race and war, the musicians were. And for millions of young people like myself, that's where the primary education first was. I mean, it gave you, the art often gives us permission to think differently. Yeah. And it's that permission which changes our lives. I mean, just like I was saying about kids in schools suspecting that something's wrong and they need somebody to explain it to them. The music was explaining it to us. And all of a sudden and it wasn't just, the truth of these situations. It was giving people, it was authenticating their passion and then giving them permission to act on it and implying that they'd had to act on it. So much of the activism of the 60s came out of that, the culture. It came out of the music, came out of and then there was a lot of art too. There was everything going on. But
are you seeing that? Are you seeing that now or over the last couple decades, sort of in different realms? I know obviously we have different sort of platforms, right, where arts can be coming out through, especially with the explosion of social media, but like just in music or in sort of more traditional arts, I don't know if are you seeing that or not seeing that? I suppose obviously it's can be different depending on where we're at in our life cycles, right? But just curious if you're seeing similarities or not seeing it at all, or what. Yeah, just what's been your observation around that?
I think the artists will do it no matter what. I think their ability to find the audience has been made more difficult. I mean, there are a lot of political and cultural forces who don't want those messages out there. When I was in the 60s, that music was ubiquitous. You turned on any radio station, commercial stations, and you heard this music. They've gotten a lot smarter than that. You don't hear a lot of the best process music, on the radio. I mean, you hear it on, commercial, not commercial, but, some community stations.
Yeah.
But not in the same way that it was at that time. And that's because it hasn't been outlawed, but it's been censored in a way. You don't have to outlaw something if you can actually keep it from reaching its audience. And I suspect the same way some platforms for visual art have also been shut down to some degree.
Yeah.
But certainly going on. I mean, there's lots of it. I mean, when I live in this little section of the Maine coast, and we put together all kinds of events around the portraits and people in the portraits and inviting them to give talks, and we do these unveilings of portraits and make a big event out of it. And we have no trouble at all in finding musicians who will perform music counter to the direction of the country at this moment. And just so it's all there. I mean, the energy's there. It's reaching the audience that's the hard thing.
No, I think that is, I mean, besides the messages, right? You said the energy. I think that is a key thing, right? We need the arts very often for that energy or that uplift or that kind of reminder that obviously the hard work of being an activist or an advocate or in a realm of real resistance is not, it's not easy work. And so, yeah, having those things are,
Well, what's so important is I mean, the arts, if they're successful, it carries not just the idea, say, of an injustice and tells you a story, but it makes you feel it at the same time that you are learning, the facts that make you feel like you've got to respond in some way.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I don't. It's like you can't retreat from that feeling. And I mean, you can, but
Yep.
if you hear it enough, maybe you won't. And so I think that's the idea. Or if you see it enough, I
Yep.
mean, it's like when people see one of my portraits that might not make much difference, but then they see, 100 of them and realize that the history of resistance in this country, and then ask themselves, well, what kind of a community do they want to be part of? The part of the community that necessitated the creation of this kind of resistance, or part of the community of resistance itself. And I think they feel that inspiration. We've a couple of times had the great fortune of showing the entire collection in one place, once at Syracuse University and just last winter at the old Bates Mills in Lewiston, Maine, the old cotton mill thing. And the reaction was astounding. I mean, me too. I mean, I paint them portrait by portrait, and to see 275 portraits all in one place, it's an installation. It's no longer a couple of portraits.
No,
It's a much
that's,
bigger statement.
yeah, yeah, no, I can see that. There was a traveling show. I don't know how far it went and since how many stops it had, but it was all about educating people on the disappearance of Indigenous women in this country. And they had portraits of a number of these women, and I don't know how many there were, maybe 50 or 60. And,
Yes,
if it would just been a couple, it would have been one thing. But to see the volume of it in the same way, I can imagine the impact that your installation had based on the effect that it had on me walking through to see and read the stories about these people that have disappeared.
exactly. Yeah. Sometimes when you see that, I think one of the things important there is it's somebody who is engaged in exposing something like that, doesn't give up soon, doesn't just say, okay, three's enough. I've done that. I'm going to go on to something else. But just in the same way that many of the big problems, any of the political, cultural problems, success often means perseverance.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean analyzing what the problem is. I mean, that's important, but
Yeah,
it's willing to not give up
yeah,
and to keep doing it and trying to keep doing it at a very high level, because that's also the thing that makes a huge difference is, the our culture has a lot of shoddiness to it, a lot of shabbiness, a lot of this is good enough for now, on to the next. And a lot of artistic projects, the artist feels, I think, that it won't be real art unless it's clear that they've spent time trying to do the best they possibly can to
hmm,
reach that level of historically good art. And real good art authenticates its own message in a way. I mean, it shows one, the respect for the subject and knowing the subject, and respect for the people who are engaged in it or portrayed in it, and an enormous respect for the audience,
yeah,
that you deserve the best there can be around this issue. And that's what, I paint to the highest level I can paint. I mean, I know there are people who paint, Rembrandt was a better portrait painter, but um, I paint as good as I can paint.
hmm,
And I know that that makes a huge difference to people, that I've tried to catch the real spirit of courage and perseverance and sometimes humor of people in the paintings.
yeah. No, for sure. I mean, I haven't seen them in person, but just seeing them online and looking through them, and I really appreciate the quotes that you add to it. There's real, yeah, there's real, they're alive, which I think is perhaps a big piece of what you were going for. So I thanked you already, by email a couple times, but as we were putting together our collection for Can You Handle the Truth, the essays that we put together on various topics of things that we've been involved in and have commented on. And, as truth tellers, that's how we see ourselves. we find opportunities to try to put those truths out there, like you say, not just to have people know about them, but obviously have people act upon them, and ideally in a positive way that will feed that transformative change. So I just want to send, again, very thankful that you accepted the offer to write the foreword to the book, and it really added a beautiful edge to what was already there. I really appreciated the way you started the essay with your Oren Lyons quote, and then the other perspectives you brought in. And again, I think it's important that we find opportunities to bring together, again, that resistance and activism, legal work or political work, but that, that the arts and that, well, culture is everything, right? And so we have to kind of figure a way to meld that together. And so I think that the book turned out quite well and better than I think we had conceived because of your participation there. So thanks, Robert,
Well, no,
for
I
that.
turn that compliment around. I mean, the work that you guys do and the truth telling you do and the energy you put into that truth telling and the organizing is critical. I mean, it's a whole different kind of thing than what I do. And I'm so glad that we could actually come together on something like this. That teaching people to get beyond the sort of notion that even in their own communities that democracy will always work, to find out that when they run up against corporate rights, their democracy may be worth nothing. No matter how well organized they are and how strong their voice is, they may lose their right to protect their own land or their own communities or whatever it is, their own air and water, corporate destruction. And then teaching that and then going to the next level and providing examples of what you can do beyond that to protect yourselves, when the notion of democracy ends and what you do when it doesn't work. That's so important to providing that lesson. Sometimes after I've had a show, somebody will interview me and say, well, you ought to paint your own self-portrait. And I say, no. This is not about me, but if there's a self-portrait, it is the entire collection, because I've chosen all these people myself. I haven't asked my team and my board to tell me who to paint or other people. I make the decisions and I take the responsibility for it. But then they say, well, if you were, what would your quote be on your portrait? And I remember I was at someplace and some students asked me that. And I said, I think my quote would be, if we really want democracy, we have to get, the big money out of politics. We have to get the corporate out of the media. We've got to get the profit out of war. And we've got to get the truth in the schools. But, after reading your book, I would add another thing like that to that, which is we've got to get property rights out of the Constitution and replace them with nature's rights.
Yeah.
That, I think, is such a key thing to everything that you do and teach and what has to be embedded in this culture if we're going to survive.
Yeah, I mean, it all circles back to, your quote from Walt Whitman, your quote from Wendell Berry, like that is the origin point, right? So if you're going to formulate government, if you're going to formulate laws, which again is why I appreciated the Oren Lyons quote about the church of nature, that we'd gotten it wrong, this separation. And in fact, we just had we put out a podcast recently through the Truth and Reckoning podcast that this program will be on. And it was a conversation with a collection of nuns who were talking about the power of the Catholic Church, the doctrine of discovery and just the level of destruction and separation of, people from the rest of the natural world, and, how they're doing their work to be rights of nature advocates, because of their own history, their own truths that they had to reconcile with. And so that's it. That's the crux there. If we can anchor ourselves there, root ourselves there, then I think good things can happen. But as we've also been talking about for the last hour, that there's so many barriers and so many obstructions and so many forces that are, of course, if that were to happen, they would not exist. And so they're going to fight for their own survival, because at the moment it is their system that we have to collapse.
That was so interesting you brought that up. When I met Oren Lyons, who was the faith keeper of the Onondaga tribe, the other thing that I didn't talk about in that foreword to your book, I don't think, was he was the first person to tell me about the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of Christian discovery. I never heard of that. And how is it possible that somebody at this time and living in the most imperialist country in the history of the world doesn't know where the ideas of imperialism came from? and how they were authenticated by the Catholic Church and then governments, and how they're eventually written into our own Constitution.
Correct.
How is that possible? We aren't taught about the origins of imperialism,
Yeah.
and why? What justifies it? That's so curious about so many of the egregious things that are done have these justifications that people don't ask. Now, where's that come from? Why do we allow that? How do you turn the atrocious into the ethical? And it's just amazing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good ending point, perhaps. I think that just amplifies the importance of what you're doing through the Americans Who Tell the Truth project. I think it's an element we've always tried to bring as well. Like, you have to keep going there. You have to keep exposing people to those kinds of things. And then, as you probably also witness, people sometimes have to take their own time, right? It's not instantaneous. For some, it can be, right? It can be like, oh my God, like this all makes sense now. It's all fallen into place. For others, it takes time, sometimes years, before it really dawns on them, what we're living in and how it's constructed
Exactly.
and its purpose and why that can't continue. And so, but we need people like you. I think we need people like our organization at the moment and others who keep pushing that, because it is critical. Like, the knowing part is critical, the reconciling with it, and then of course the action that comes to ideally drive us towards right relationship. All of that has to come together.
That's why perseverance is so key.
Yep.
It's not just being willing to get arrested once, but to keep going,
Yeah.
because people don't change immediately. We're so married often to our own ideologies and excuses and justifications. It's very hard for us to change. But I was wanted to, I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to mention, well, first I would invite anybody who looks at this to go to the American Who Tell the Truth website and go through the portrait
Absolutely.
gallery and
For sure.
just look at some of the portraits and read the quotes. I've tried to present, not softballs about truth telling, but, serious things that are worth discussion and challenging. But one of them that isn't actually on the portrait, but the person who's been so important to me was Frederick Douglass.
Mhm.
Getting to know him and how complicated and flawed, like all of us, he was as a person. He made big mistakes, but he also is arguably maybe the greatest American of all time. I mean, even more important than Lincoln in a way in the 19th century. But, a thing that he said stays with me all the time. He said, find out what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong that will be imposed on them. That to me seems to be so critical for the thinking of where we are at this moment in this country. What are we going to do? We know that, you know, so many people are submitting so quickly out of fear of who knows what. I mean, there are various ways they're coming at us. But if we submit, the injustice and wrong that will be imposed will be way worse than it is already. I mean, the future because of the importance of this country in the world and how the world does things is critical in the way we, as Americans, respond to this moment. And we really have to take the risks that will make a as good a ending to this or transition as we could possibly manage without taking those risks. And that's the whole message of the Americans Who Tell the Truth project, is about taking those risks. And then, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund teaches us how to do it in ways that I don't teach, but you guys do.
Yeah, it's that courage you spoke of, the perseverance, and then I would say confidence, right? Because you got to have the confidence that it can happen. Yeah, all that has to come together, and I think
We have to see the lessons
Yeah.
that people. There's a wonderful. Can I tell one little more story?
Absolutely.
I painted Rosa Parks, of course, and then I heard the story of Claudette Colvin. I did not know that story. This was, 9 months before Rosa Parks in Montgomery, the same year, 1955. In March, a 15-year-old girl refused to move on a bus in Montgomery. She had just been through Negro History Week in her school. That was the precursor to Black History Month. When she was told to move, it was the same situation. She was in the front row of the black section, the white section filled up. Bus driver pointed at her and said, "You've got to go stand in the back." And she said, Claudette Colvin said, the Constitution allows me to sit here. I mean, think about how that might have gone over in a bus like that in those days. And of course, you were risking your life. I mean, those were the days, 1955 in Montgomery, churches were blown up, schools were blown up, houses, people were shot, lynched, etc. Exceedingly dangerous. And she knew that, but she did it. And later, she was asked why, many years later, why she didn't move. And she said, well, I wanted to move. I started to stand up, and I felt Harriet Tubman's hand on my shoulder, pushing me back down. She said, I tried to get up again, and it was Sojourner Truth's hand on my other shoulder, pushing me back down. So I had to ask myself, what would they do? And there was only one answer. And then she said, history glued me to my seat. History glued me to my seat. That's why knowing these stories is so damn important. To have that community of courage that when we need it, we want to say, well, which group do we want to be with here? Even if they're just the ghosts in my own mind at this moment. I want to be part of that community. And to me, that's what it's all about.
Well, Robert, thank you. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do. And I hope we can maybe collaborate.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to CELDF.org. That's CELDF.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.